The morning Nora walked back into her life, Celeste had flour on her hands and a 6-year-old boy demanding chocolate chips in his pancakes. That was how ordinary the day had started. That was how completely unprepared she was. She'd been running the cafe for 4 years. Little Wren on the corner of Ashford and 5th in Charleston, South Carolina, with its mismatched chairs and hand-painted chalkboard menus and the smell of brown butter that never fully left the walls. It was hers. Entirely, completely hers. She had built it after everything fell apart, when she had nothing left but a positive pregnancy test and $3,000 in a checking account she hadn't told anyone about. She had built it with shaking hands and a stubbornness that surprised even herself. Her son's name was Owen. He had her dark hair and someone else's gray eyes, and she did not let herself think about that too often. Mama. He was tugging at the hem of her apron, his small fingers sticky from a stolen blueberry. You said chocolate chips. I said maybe chocolate chips. You said yes, chocolate chips. She looked down at him. He had that expression, the serious, unblinking one that meant he had already decided the argument was over, and she just hadn't caught up yet. 6 years old, and he already negotiated like a lawyer. Fine, she said. Chocolate chips. He pumped his fist and ran back to the corner booth where he always sat on Saturday mornings, the one next to the window with the crooked latch that let in a draft she'd been meaning to fix since February. The cafe wasn't open yet. It was 7:45, the light outside still pale and soft, and Celeste had 45 minutes before her first customers arrived and 30 minutes before her 2 employees, Bex and Marcus, came in to help with the rush. Saturday mornings were her favorite shift and her hardest one. She liked the rhythm of it. She liked needing to move faster than her own thoughts. She was pouring batter onto the griddle when the back door opened. She assumed it was Bex. Bex was always early on Saturdays because she lived 4 blocks away and was constitutionally incapable of sleeping past 6. Celeste didn't look up. Coffee's almost done, she called. I already started yours. Silence. She looked up. The man standing in her kitchen doorway was not Bex. She hadn't seen him in 7 years, but her body recognized him before her mind did. Some cold animal thing that lived at the base of her spine, that remembered danger the way skin remembered fire. Her hand went still on the spatula. The batter hissed against the griddle, and she didn't move to fix it. Celeste, said Nolan Voss. He looked the same. That was the part she hadn't been prepared for, that 7 years could pass, and a man like him could absorb them without a trace. He was leaner, maybe. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before. But he wore the same kind of dark suit, the same quiet authority, the same expression of a man who had never once in his life walked into a room he wasn't certain he owned. She set the spatula down carefully. Her hands were not shaking. She was very focused on making sure her hands were not shaking. You need to leave, she said. I've been looking for you for 2 years. Then you wasted 2 years. You need to leave. He didn't move. His eyes traveled past her to the small pass-through window that looked into the dining area, and she watched his gaze find Owen, sitting in the corner booth, feet swinging above the floor, absorbed in the picture book he'd dragged out of his backpack. Nolan went very still. Celeste moved. She stepped sideways, putting herself between the window and him, the griddle smoking behind her, and her voice came out so quiet it barely qualified as sound. Don't. He looked back at her. Something had changed in his face. Something had cracked open just slightly at the edges, in a way she'd only seen once before, the night she told him she loved him, and he'd looked at her like the words had physically struck him. How old? He said. You need to leave my kitchen. Celeste, Nolan. She said his name the same way he'd said hers. Flat, contained, a warning dressed as a greeting. I have 40 minutes before I open, and my son is 10 feet away, and I am asking you to leave. He left. She stood at the back door after she'd locked it and breathed through her nose for a count of 10. The pancakes were burning. She turned back to the griddle, scraped them, started again. Owen appeared in the doorway. Mama? Is breakfast ready? Almost, baby. Go sit back down. I heard the door. Bex isn't here yet. It was a delivery. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, too perceptive for 6, too much her eyes in his face, and then he disappeared back to his booth. She pressed both hands flat against the counter and stared at the griddle and made herself take one breath, and then another, and then the batter was poured, and she was moving again, and that was the only thing that mattered. She had spent 7 years getting very good at moving instead of thinking. She'd met Nolan Voss when she was 26 and newly arrived in Atlanta, catering an event for a nonprofit she'd been working for that summer. She hadn't known what he was then. Not exactly. Not in any specific way. She'd known he was wealthy. She'd known he had the kind of presence that made a crowded room reorient around him without his seeming to notice or care. She'd known his last name because it was on half the buildings in the city. What she hadn't known was the rest. She'd found out slowly. Small things first. The way people sometimes flinched when they spoke to him, the calls he took in other rooms, the men who stood at the edges of spaces he occupied. She'd asked him once, early on, what exactly he did. He'd looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "I manage assets." And she had let herself believe that. For 8 months, she had let herself believe exactly as much as she wanted to believe. She hadn't been stupid. She wanted to be clear about that, even just to herself. She hadn't been naive or foolish or willfully blind. She'd been 26 and alone in a new city, and she had fallen in love with someone she shouldn't have, and she had convinced herself that the parts of him she couldn't see were simply private, the way anyone had private parts. She had wanted him to be the man he was in the hours they were together. Then she'd found the documents in his office. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for a pen, the most banal reason in the world to stumble into something that collapsed your entire understanding of a person. She hadn't understood all of it. She hadn't needed to. She'd understood enough. She'd left before dawn the next day. She hadn't told him she was going. She hadn't told him the other thing either, the thing she'd only found out the week before, the small, impossible thing that was already changing the shape of her future, whether she chose to acknowledge it or not. She'd driven north on I-85 with everything she owned in the back of her car, and she had not looked back, not once. She was very proud of that. He came back the next morning. She'd been awake most of the night, sitting at her kitchen table in the apartment above the cafe, listening to Owen breathe through the baby monitor. She still kept, even though he was 6, and had told her twice recently that baby monitors were embarrassing. She'd planned what she would say. She'd rehearsed it. She'd been calm and certain and decided by 3 in the morning. When she heard the knock at the cafe's front door at 7 a.m., the closed sign still up, the lights still off, she felt none of that calm. She felt a cold, electric thing move through her chest and her hands go to her pockets as if looking for something to hold. She went downstairs alone. Owen was still asleep. Nolan was standing on the sidewalk in the pale morning. He wasn't alone. She could see half a block down, a black car idling at the curb, a man standing beside it, but he'd come to the door by himself. He had something in his hand. She recognized it from the window before she opened the door. It was a coffee cup from the place 2 blocks over, and there was a second one, and he held them like a man who had rehearsed a gesture and was now uncertain whether it would land. She opened the door. She did not invite him in. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me nothing." She leaned against the doorframe. "And I don't owe you anything either. I know that. Then why are you here?" He set the coffees down on the small ledge beside the door, a gesture of relinquishment, of "I'm not asking you to take anything." He looked at her with that expression she'd never been able to properly prepare for, the one that was too honest for the rest of him, that sat wrong in his face like a window cut into a wall. "I need to know," he said. "The boy. His name is Owen." Something moved across his face. "Is he?" "Yes." She said it before he could finish because she did not want to hear the question. She was so tired of carrying the answer alone that she said it to make it stop. "Yes, he's yours." Nolan was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know you were pregnant," he said finally. "I know you didn't. Why didn't you?" "Because I found out what you were," she said, "and I decided to give him a different life." Her voice stayed level. She had practiced this. "I don't regret it." He absorbed this without flinching. That was the thing about Nolan Voss that she had always found most unnerving. He absorbed blows without visibly reacting, processed them somewhere deep and internal and unreachable, and came back with something that looked like stillness, but was actually just a different kind of moving. "He looks like you," Nolan said. "He has your eyes." A pause. "I noticed. I need you to understand something." She straightened up from the doorframe. "I'm not asking you for anything. I never did. Whatever you want from this conversation, from finding me, I need you to know that I am not going to give you access to him, not to my son, not to this. I understand. I don't think you do." "I understand," he said again, and his voice was so quiet she almost missed the way it broke at the edge, "that you have no reason to trust me. I understand that what you found was true and that I let you believe something different for 8 months. I understand that you made the only choice that made sense." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not here to argue with any of that. I'm here because I needed to see you. I've been trying to find you for 2 years, and I found you." A pause. I needed to know you were safe." Celeste looked at him for a long moment. "We're safe," she said. "We've been safe. I made sure of that." He nodded. He reached up and picked up both coffee cups. He held one out to her. She took it. She did not know what made her take it. She would think about that later, at the kitchen table, after he'd gone, why she'd taken the cup, what that meant, whether it meant anything at all. She would tell herself it was just coffee. She would not entirely believe herself. She told her best friend that afternoon, after Owen's soccer practice, after he'd fallen asleep in the back seat with his cleats still on. Danny had been her closest friend since they'd been neighbors 2 years ago. Danny, who ran the bookshop 2 streets over. Danny, who had strong opinions about everything, including but not limited to the correct way to make a Negroni, whether orange cats had distinct personalities, and which of Celeste's past relationships had been catastrophically ill-advised. Danny was quiet for an unusually long time after Celeste finished. "The Nolan Voss," she said. "You dated the Nolan Voss. I didn't know exactly who he was when I started, and you've been not telling me this for 3 years, 2 years. I didn't know you for the first year, Celeste." Danny set down her Negroni. "He is not a man who manages assets. I know that now. He runs half the port logistics in the Southeast." Which is a very polite way of saying, "I know what it means, Danny." Danny was quiet again. Outside, Owen was audible in the backyard, narrating a soccer match to himself with great intensity. "What does he want?" Danny asked. "I don't know yet. What do you want?" Celeste stared at her glass. That was the question, wasn't it? She'd spent 7 years wanting simple things: a stable income, a safe apartment, a good school for Owen, enough sleep, enough time. She'd organized her life around the absence of complication. She'd been so deliberate about it. She'd been so careful. "I want him to leave us alone," she said. She was not entirely sure that was still true. He came back a 3rd time, and she had made a decision by then. If he was going to be persistent, she was going to be the one to control the terms of it. She met him at the café before hours, with Owen at her neighbor's house, and Bex informed that if Celeste sent a specific text, she was to call in the next 5 minutes with a fictional emergency. She also, quietly, called a friend of hers from college, who was now a federal attorney, and asked some questions she'd been holding in her head for 7 years. She took notes. She felt calmer after that. "I'm not going to hide anymore," she told Nolan, when they were sitting across from each other with coffee she'd made herself, in her own cafe, on her own terms. "If you've found me, other people from that part of your life can find me too. I need to understand the risk." He looked slightly surprised. She'd expected him to be surprised. "I've spent 3 years making sure you don't have exposure," he said carefully. "I don't need you to protect me. I need to understand the actual level of risk so I can make decisions." She set down her cup. "I have a son. He goes to school 6 blocks from here. He has a life I've built very carefully. If your being in Charleston changes any of the math on our safety, I need to know that before I decide how much contact to allow." "Allow," he said. "Yes, allow." She held his gaze. "You found us. That part is done. But what happens now is something I get to decide, not you. I want to be very clear about that." Nolan looked at her for a long moment. His expression was complicated in a way she'd stopped letting herself interpret too carefully. "Yes," he said. "You do." That wasn't the answer she'd expected. She'd expected pushback, or negotiation, or the quiet pressure she remembered, the way he'd had 7 years ago, of making his preferences felt in a room without ever stating them outright. Instead, he just sat across from her in the morning light of her cafe and agreed, simply and completely, and it undid her more than any argument would have. "I want to meet him," he said, "when you're ready, if you're ever ready. But I want to be clear, I'm not going to put pressure on you. I know what I did. I know what you gave up by leaving. I'm not going to make this harder than it already is. Why did you look for me? Because I didn't stop thinking about you." His voice was quiet. "Not once. In 7 years." She looked down at her coffee. "That's not a good enough reason to come back into my son's life," she said. "I know. I'm not using it as one." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because I'm done being someone who keeps things from you." She did not let him meet Owen that week, or the week after. She told herself she was being careful. She told herself she was thinking it through, weighing it, being the kind of methodical, deliberate person she'd had to become. And that was all true. But the truth beside it, the one she turned away from every time it tried to surface, was that she was scared. Not of Nolan, exactly. Not anymore, or at least not the way she'd been afraid when she drove north at 26, with her hands white-knuckled on the wheel. She was scared of what it would look like. Owen and Nolan in the same room. Her son, who had never once asked about his father, who had a 6-year-old's total acceptance of the family he had and no apparent sense of its gaps. Seeing the man who shared his gray eyes. She was scared of what Owen might want afterward. She was scared of what she might want. The 4th week, Owen solved it himself. She'd made the mistake of taking an important call at the cafe counter while Owen was at a table nearby with his sketchbook. And she'd been so absorbed in the call, her linen supplier having a catastrophic inventory problem, that she hadn't noticed Nolan come in until Owen had already looked up and made eye contact with him. Owen studied him with the unabashed directness that only small children and very self-assured adults ever managed. "You were here before," Owen said. "I saw you through the window that first morning." Nolan stopped. He looked at Owen with an expression Celeste had never seen on him before, completely unguarded, momentarily stripped of everything, and said very quietly, "I was. Do you know my mom?" A pause. "Yes? From before?" "From a long time before." Owen considered this with enormous seriousness. "She has old friends," he said. "She doesn't talk about them much." He held up his sketchbook. "I'm drawing the building across the street, the one with the green shutters. Do you think green shutters are good or bad?" Nolan sat down across from him. He looked at the drawing, a surprisingly competent building for a 6-year-old, Celeste thought, watching from across the room with the phone still to her ear and no idea what her supplier was saying anymore. He looked at the drawing and said, "I think green shutters are very good, actually. Better than white ones. White ones are boring." Owen nodded with great satisfaction. "That's what I think too." Celeste finished the call. She stood very still for a moment. Then she crossed the cafe and sat down beside her son, across from the man she'd run from 7 years ago, and she ordered herself a second coffee because it seemed like the only rational thing to do. "His name is Nolan," she said to Owen. Owen looked between them. He was 6, but he was not incapable of basic inference. "Okay," he said, and went back to his drawing. It didn't happen all at once. Things like this never did. That was what she'd had to accept over the months that followed, that there was no single moment of resolution, no afternoon, where everything clicked into place, and she knew how to feel, and what to want, and what was safe. Life didn't grant you those. Life gave you incremental things. Nolan spending Saturday mornings at the corner table, initially pretending to read and gradually abandoning the pretense. Owen showing him drawings without being asked, then asking him questions, then demanding his opinion on matters of great importance, such as whether dinosaurs would beat sharks in a fight, and which type of donut was objectively superior. Life gave her Danny leaning against the cafe counter one morning watching Nolan help Owen with a ketchup bottle and saying quietly, "You know he's in love with you." "I know," Celeste said, and I don't know yet." Danny looked at her. "Yes, you do." She did. She'd known for a while, probably, the way you sometimes know things before you're ready to admit knowing them, carrying the knowledge around like something fragile you can't set down yet because you're not sure where it goes. She'd known when she took the coffee cup that first morning. She'd known when she called her attorney friend, because she wouldn't have bothered to understand the risk if she'd truly intended to make him leave. What she knew about Nolan was this: he had lied to her, or at least withheld, and she did not minimize that. She'd spent a lot of time not minimizing it. But she also knew that the man who had sat across from her in her cafe and said what happens now is something you decide and meant it, who had come back not to claim anything, but only to know she was safe, who had been showing up every Saturday for 4 months and had never once pushed, never once suggested that his patience entitled him to anything. That man was something she had not known how to imagine when she was 26. And she'd found those documents, and her entire understanding of him had caved in. People could be more than one thing. She knew that. She'd had to learn it about herself, too. That she could be someone who had loved unwisely and still be someone good. That those weren't in contradiction. She'd had to stop treating her own history as evidence of a flaw. She brought it up on a Tuesday, which seemed like the right kind of day for something that wasn't romantic but also wasn't casual. A Tuesday afternoon with Owen at his playdate, and the cafe closed, and the light coming through the windows in long amber bars. "I need to know what you want," she said. "Not from him. I mean, I know what you want from Owen. I understand that. I mean from me." Nolan put down his coffee. "You know the answer to that. I need you to say it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the street, someone was mowing a lawn, and the smell of cut grass drifted in through the open window above the sink. "I want to be here," he said. "For him and for you, if you'll have it. I know I don't deserve to ask for that. I'm asking anyway. What does that look like, specifically? I need specifics, not feelings." He almost smiled at that. It was a thing he'd started doing recently, almost smiling, a thing that looked like it surprised him slightly each time. "It looks like this. Saturday mornings. Being someone reliable instead of someone dangerous. I've been spending the last 2 years restructuring things, stepping away from the parts that—" He stopped, chose different words. "I'm not going to pretend I can undo what I was, but I'm not that anymore. Not entirely, and I'm working on the rest. I'm going to need documentation of that. I know. I have it." She believed him. That was the strange part, that after 7 years and everything that had passed between them, she believed him. Not blindly. Not because love made her stupid, the way she'd been afraid it had when she was 26. But with her eyes open, with the questions she'd asked, with the attorney on speed dial, and the knowledge that she'd rebuilt herself once and could do it again if she had to. She believed him because she'd watched him with Owen for 4 months, and what she'd seen was a man learning something. Learning how to be careful with someone small and trusting. Learning how to earn instead of assume. Learning how to show up without knowing if the showing up would ever be enough. And she knew better than most how much that could cost. "I'm not promising you anything," she told him. "I'm not asking for a promise. I'm saying I'm willing to try. That's all I'm saying." He nodded. There it was again, almost a smile, and then a real one, small and careful. And she hadn't seen him smile since she was 26 years old, sitting across from him at a restaurant in Atlanta, thinking he might be the most interesting person I've ever met. It looked different now. Quieter. Like something earned. "That's everything," he said. Owen found out properly on a Sunday in November, the kind of cold, bright Sunday where the light was sharp and everything smelled like leaves. They'd been talking about it for weeks. How to tell him, what to say, whether 6 was old enough to understand, and what understanding would mean for him. They'd read things. Celeste had called a child psychologist friend from college and had a long conversation about language and age appropriateness, and what children needed most in these moments, which turned out not to be the whole complicated truth all at once, but rather clarity, safety, and the knowledge that nothing about the love around them was in question. They sat with him on the couch with hot chocolate. Owen's idea, he'd been on a hot chocolate campaign for weeks, and Celeste had told him, simply, that Nolan was his dad, that she and Nolan had loved each other a long time ago, and then had been apart for a long time, and that Owen had been growing up all that while, and that now Nolan was here, and wanted very much to be Owen's father, if Owen wanted that too. Owen had been quiet for longer than Celeste had ever seen him be quiet. Then he looked at Nolan and said, "Do you know how to play Minecraft?" Nolan blinked. "No, I'll teach you," Zaned, with the magnanimous air of someone bestowing a great gift. "It's complicated, but you'll get it." Celeste pressed her face into her coffee mug so Owen wouldn't see her eyes. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. She wouldn't have wanted one. She was 33 years old, and she'd built her own life from the rubble of choices she'd made and choices that had been made for her, and she knew that real things didn't resolve. They evolved. There would be hard conversations still to come, with Owen and between them. There would be things from Nolan's past that surfaced in uncomfortable ways, because pasts did not simply become clean because you decided to clean them. There would be mornings she looked at him across the breakfast table and felt the old ghost of 26-year-old fear, and she would have to decide each time to stay anyway. But she knew how to decide to stay. She'd been doing it for 6 years, staying in a city that wasn't the one she was born in, staying in a business she'd started knowing nothing, staying present for a child when she was exhausted and scared and doing it alone. She knew what staying cost, and she knew what it made. On a Saturday in December, Little Wren was full and warm, and the chalkboard said today's special, cardamom brown butter cake, and Owen was in his corner booth, drawing something with a ferocity that suggested artistic crisis. And Nolan was at the counter reading something on his phone, and occasionally stealing sips of coffee from the cup she'd made him without being asked. And Bex was singing to herself behind the espresso machine, and the windows were fogged from the cold outside and the warmth within. Celeste stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it. She had made this, every single piece of it, the cafe and the boy and the life that had grown up quietly around her while she was busy surviving. The rest was just what came next. And she found, standing there in the warmth and the smell of cardamom and burnt sugar, that she was no longer afraid of what came next. She was ready for it.